Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to AOPA's webinar on purchasing an aircraft. My name is Mike Felucci. I have the pleasure of working with two outstanding teams here at AOPA, the Pilot Information Center team and the Flight Operations team. And with me here tonight is Ray Speciale, who's an attorney here with AOPA, and Rodney Martz, a Senior Aviation Technical Specialist with the AOPA Pilot Information Center.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello, good evening.
We also have remotely Cher Claire, who's with our AOPA Insurance Services team, and she'll be on hand to answer questions via text messaging.
Hi, Cher.
This webinar is brought to you by AOPA Insurance Services. So what we're going to cover tonight, well, let me start with a sound check. If you lose audio during this webinar, if you have an iPad or an iPhone, make sure you click the play button to hear the sound. Sometimes you have to stop the sound and restart to make it work. If you're on a PC, try refreshing your screen or exit the webinar and log back in, and that may solve your problem. So what we're going to cover tonight is finding the aircraft that's best for you, the purchase process, including inspections, paperwork, title services, insurance, and then finalizing the deal. So the first step is deciding what you want to buy.
Now, this is always fun. I'm sure guys and gals, if you're like us in the room here, anywhere between the office, the airport cafe, the flight line, and everywhere in between, you've been talking with your pilot buddies about what would be the ideal airplane, what's it really cost to go faster, do I really need 2 seats, 4, 6, 6 seats or more, and how would I best afford all of this, and what should I really do in the real world? So that's what we're going to try to talk about a little bit tonight. We're going to talk about, where you want to fly and how often. I just mentioned about the passenger seats, obviously, whether you're really thinking about VFR or IFR or training for either. We do talk to a number of student pilots here in the Pilot Information Center as well who might be buying an aircraft for initial training, so we'll mention that. We'll try to touch base and show you where and how to find out about the costs to fly and maintain. And, of course, as well as number of seats, range and speed are other factors we might want to talk about. So we'll see how this goes.
So tagging on to what Rodney said, I get these questions a lot. What aircraft should I buy? And really, it's really defined by the mission. What are you going to use the airplane for? And it's also defined by what's your passion in aviation. Do I want the family airplane, or do I want that Pitts S1 or S2, or do I want a Warbird, or do I want a 1-seater or a 2-seater? And what I generally tell folks is that my experience has been that most of the time we as pilots end up flying solo or possibly with one passenger. If that's really the case, and you've really got to have to examine your own situation, then my recommendation always is go for the airplane you really want. And if you need a family airplane or a 4-seater to go somewhere on that rare occasion, just go ahead and rent one.
And that's the other thing we can mention, the figure for aircraft mission. Think about your flying as an aircraft mission. The figure there that we often talk about is 80 or even 85%. What you'd probably like to buy is an aircraft that would meet 85% of your intended flight missions. For those other 15%, you can probably rent or borrow. And again, Cher can answer any questions you have about insurance as we get to that point. But as an aircraft owner, you will additionally already have coverage to borrow or rent aircraft at a certain level. So that's something that's kind of a tip to keep in mind.
So let's talk about costs.
Yeah, on sharing obviously we're primarily thinking about individual ownership, but we also are going to talk about sharing costs. Co-ownerships and flying clubs, everybody are kind of aware of those, but we're going to talk about those a little bit more because in addition to cost savings, there's also the encouragement and the information provided by a larger group of pilots, the family or other aviation activities. and all of AOPA's Flying Club resources. And I'm sure if you're thinking about a flying club, starting one this year, you've probably seen, so is AOPA. So one of our bright, shiny, newly refurbished, reimagined Cessna 150s, as you've seen on the website, will be given away this fall to a lucky applicant, which is a brand new Flying Club startup. So that's a good way, that's a great way to start.
The next question that comes up is, where do I look? Where in the heck do I look to try and find the airplane of my dreams? There's a wide range of places you can start locally, right at your local airport there. You can take a look at the airport bulletin boards. There's also lots of websites out there that list aircraft for sale of all types. Trade a Plane, Aircraft Shopper Online, Barnstormers, Controller, and then Type Club websites. If you're interested in a Bonanza, for instance, the American Bonanza Society has a website, and they have a classified section. There's the Cessna Pilots Association, the Cardinal Flyers online group. If you want something more classic, there's the Swift Museum Foundation, the Cessna 195 Club. If you want something in the way of a warbird, there's the T-34 Association, the North American Trainer Association, and multiple other warbird groups, including the Red Star Pilots Association. So there's lots of places to look.
We thought we could start with a couple of red flags here, and we've got a nice picture, as you'll probably recognize, of a previously leaking tank. Is it leaking now? Not sure. Had it been leaking? Certainly looks like it has. Is that just the simple $25 drain assembly, or is it a leak in the bottom of the aluminum tank, or is it a leak in the rubber fuel bladder that could be there as well?
Sure.
As a tank? So just something to think about. Obviously, you want to be aware of aircraft that don't fit your mission. You want to take a look at logbooks and ownership records that don't agree. There's lots to read in books and records, but if you see something that's not logical, then it probably is not, so you'd want to investigate. Unmanaged corrosion. All older airplanes may have some flecks of surface corrosion on inside skin panels that were not factory or later treated or chromated originally, but that's very ordinary. The concern you as a buyer have is working with your mechanic, and we'll talk about that in a moment, on looking at areas that maybe are often not as easily seen, or surprisingly, most all airplanes that have any concern, all the airplanes of that make and model may have that same concern, simply because it's an area that either doesn't ventilate well or has other moisture issues, or, as we know, it could be where the aircraft has been based or the way it's been maintained.
Sure, and in this picture you can see the corrosion, but what your real concern is the corrosion you don't see, and that's why you'll want to hire an AMP or an IA to do a thorough pre-buy inspection. And as Rodney said, certain aircraft do have a tendency to corrode in the same areas.
Exactly.
And that's something you can also research in the various type clubs for particular airplanes, because they have lots of information on the history of the aircraft, where corrosion is prevalent in those aircraft. So that's another good source. And of course, last and not least, if the aircraft is beyond your financial means, or if it's beyond your piloting skills, then that's a red flag you want to be aware of.
Although we can mention, we'll talk about aircraft financing in a moment, and it's quite a bit more cost-effective on a monthly payment basis than you might realize. We'll show you how to check some things there. And piloting means, obviously, training is always available. So you may need to search that out if you're shopping for an upgrade.
And I just want to tag on what Rodney said about logbooks. This is a critical item. If the logbooks are missing, I mean entirely missing, you have to understand that could devalue your aircraft by 20% or more. So that's a real red flag you've got to be careful of.
Although, as a tip, depending on the aircraft model, we will be able to talk tonight about some of the reports that you can purchase as an AOPA member from the AOPA's title vendor, which we'll talk about in a moment, that has FAA record availability that may help you mitigate concerns along the way. For instance, like certain lost logbooks. So we'll talk about that too as a tip. I'm going to talk about VREF here next. VREF is an online service available for members that's essentially dealer book pricing that is made available to the average pilot and owner at his convenience. This has been around for about 20 years, not always available, like I said, to the individual pilot, but about 20 years ago we put the program in place to make that available online. Essentially, VREF is a pricing guide where dealers provide the reference company on a quarterly basis information about their sales in the previous quarter. So you are getting live data from previous sales as reported to one central location and adjusted by them for condition. So it's a pretty good factor like that. They do have to group aircraft as far as condition and equipment, but that's part of the process. So even though every aircraft is different, there is a breakdown by make and model year, and that's available online. If you're looking at turbine equipment, you would give us a call because online we just have piston equipment at this time.
And VREF also has the advantage of tracking trends in aircraft sales. So you can actually see fluctuations in the sale prices of aircraft over a period of time. So you can see, well, is it a buyer's market? Is it a seller's market? Is the trend going downward? Is the trend going upward, or is it flat?
Exactly, Mike, and that's a good handy item. You will need to call us at the Pilot Information Center for that trend history. That's one item by contract that wasn't online. But again, we have that for you. That's available. And what I can also do, if you like, I do have access to the historic files on aircraft by make and model, where I can give you a 15-year trend history if you'd like. Pretty interesting to look at any aircraft you're buying over the last 15 years, just to get insight where the total market is going or versus the aircraft you're looking at. So if that can help you out, just give me a call at the Pilot Information Center, and we can print you that graph and send it out.
You know, Rodney, it sort of dawned on me as I was looking at this that when we get the sales and use tax, the sales and use tax authorities in many states are linked into VREF and some other valuation services as well, and they can go back a few years and figure out how much it was that you probably paid for an aircraft.
You are exactly right. The pricing trends are based on average time and midlife engines and midlife airframes, but you're right. The states have access to all that just as well, as do the banks, of course.
Sure.
Well, now that we've figured out, or you've figured out exactly how much you can spend on an airplane and what airplane you're looking at, now you can start looking at financing. Interest rates are going to depend on the amount of the loan and the type of aircraft. Larger loans typically get a lower rate, and of course the smaller loans come in at a higher rate. AOPA has a finance division, and they're ready during the normal working hours every week to provide you with financing information.
I just called the financing group this afternoon to get some basic information to provide you this evening. Although every situation can be a little bit different, we've got some general current information for you here. Typical individual would currently obtain a loan that has a 12, 15, or 20-year amortization rate. Typical down payment is 15%, and you see the rates 4.75 over 100 or 6.5 under 100,000. And if you punch up some numbers on that, I just had my trusty calculator out here a minute ago, and I think I did that, although I didn't save it. But for instance, what I did is I punched up in my finance calculator a $35,000 airplane, 15% down, and using the 6.5 rate then, a 20-year amortization. It was about $250 a month. So $250 a month is probably, what, Mike, only about half of what you'd pay on a simple lease on a new car loan. So the aircraft payments are pretty efficient these days.
Yes, they are. And just remember, though, this is strictly a snapshot in time that was taken today, and these rates, just like other rates, mortgage rates and every other rate that we deal with, are subject to change and fluctuation.
Absolutely. What the finance group does, they act as a brokerage unit for working with and obtaining loans for members from a variety of banks throughout the country. So they can they put together a package of options for you.
So once you look at the financing, in Rodney's example, he said he figured $250 a month for the aircraft that he was calculating for. Then you've got the continuing ownership costs that will add on to that monthly payment. And you have fixed costs. Those are typically the costs that you'll pay on an annual basis, such as insurance, your hangar fee or tie-down fee, inspections, and then you have your operating costs, and that'll be the fuel you burn for each hour, depending on the engine and the way you run the airplane. Your oil changes, additional oil you'll burn as you run the engine, overhaul reserves, maintenance reserves, annual inspection costs, insurance. These are a combination of fixed costs and operating costs. Database updates, a lot of people overlook that, but if you have any kind of a certified GPS in the airplane, you're gonna have some database update costs that if you're going to keep your aircraft database up to date.
A couple other things I can throw in there. If you haven't already seen it, AOPA does have an aircraft operating cost calculator spreadsheet on the website. Just Google it up under that name, operating costs, aircraft operating cost. What we've done there, we've laid it out in kind of Excel type of spreadsheet form, but it asks, the program online goes and asks you questions one after another to make estimates in all of these items. And as you probably realize, it's pretty straightforward. You can easily calculate fuel and oil costs per hour. You can easily calculate insurance and tie down by simply pricing those services. You can price your hangar. Then you're left with basic maintenance is always the most unknown item. But again, we make some estimates on that with that online sheet. And we also say the best person to ask about maintenance costs is your local mechanic that you either are or will be working with. He has much better knowledge on pricing than you might already realize. Plus, he has a vested interest in working with you on in potential aircraft ownership, because I'm sure he'd like the extra business. So he's going to try to do the best he can. So that's a good place to ask basic questions. The other tips we'd want to throw out for you here this evening, when checking on a purchase, one of the things we always do is ask to see the seller's last year or the last 2 years actual billings for the annual inspection. Not just, I'm most concerned about how much they were, but we'd also like to see an itemized breakdown of just what was done. It may have been a lot or it may have been a little, but that gives you a lot of insight on, number one, what to expect this year, and number two, what's been the history of the airplane. So owners have those bills, probably, certainly. It's not something they necessarily volunteer. They don't think about it, but it's easy enough to ask for that, and it's something easy to get, and you can learn a lot from it.
Yeah, when you look at an annual inspection, a basic inspection, you can probably come up with a reasonable number for kind of a standard run-of-the-mill inspection. But my experience has been sometimes my annual inspections have been more or less within that range, but then I get interested in adding this piece of equipment or that piece of equipment or modifying this or modifying that, and the next thing you know, my costs for the annual inspection has gone double that number. So that's just something to be aware of.
And the other thing I wanted to add that I went too fast by on financing was AOPA does have online a monthly payment calculator. I think it's listed under, I think it's just simply listed monthly payment calculator. So you can just Google that. Obviously, most any website on the internet you can Google up and get a mortgage loan calculator, and you can use that calculator in the same way. Just plug in your rates and plug in your length of term. You know, guys, while we're here, we didn't talk about this at first. I didn't think we'll have to think about this. Questions. We can take some questions now, or we can hold all questions to the end, or we can do a little bit of both. I'm just looking at this sheet, and I'm thinking, since some of these apply to precisely what we've just talked about on value and buying, we can maybe run through a few of these right now if you'd like.
Sure, jump on it.
All
Sure,
right.
jump on it.
Since I do this every day, so I can run through these fairly quickly for us, I think. First question, how does one know the fair price for an aircraft that's 50 years old, has 4,500 hours on the airframe, along with 1980s avionics? Good question, and the answer very clearly is our VREF. The VREF gives us all that data. The only thing it does not give you is the value of 1980s avionics. However, since this is a dealer workbook, you'll use the same type of system that the dealer uses, and that is, since VREF estimates what a typical airplane at this time has in it for avionics, that's your baseline. It doesn't matter that the 1950s airplane or the 50-year-old airplane has older avionics, obviously, when it was made. We're looking at some spot in time now, and the VREF will actually say, even for a 50-year-old airplane, it'll say dual digital navcoms. So you can go from that as a baseline. If you've added a Garmin 430, that's a plus. If you have two KX170Bs, that's going to be a minus, and the dollar amount is how much it takes to make that change either up or down. Just that simple. All right, real quick second question. For car buying, we get an approximate starting price from KBB.com or Edmonton.com and a history from Carfax. Are there equivalent resources in aircraft buying? Yeah, again, VREF is going to replace KBB, and Carfax is essentially replaced with your title search. We'll talk about that in a moment. AOPA's title search provides you a complete electronic copy of all documents filed in the aircraft, and that'll pretty much show its whole history like a Carfax would. Oh, and it does include incident or accident listings as well. So that would replace that. Okay, question number 3. What do you consider the biggest factor in buying an aircraft as it relates to model year, total time, since major overhaul, and previous use as a trainer or anything else? Well, guys, you can jump in here. I think the biggest factor is still your passion, your desire, how you like it, its general value to you. Most obviously most general aviation aircraft have no limiting total time, so that's really not too big a factor. Engine major overhaul is pretty much a straightforward linear graph of where it is either up or down from midlife. And use as a trainer, it depends on the airplane. You can make some judgments. I don't think trainers may have had some harder landings, but they've usually had more maintenance attention to the small things as well. So it's kind of a trade-off.
And you also generally haven't been sitting there a lot either.
That's right.
So there are some benefits to that.
And there again, I fall back to what I said. The guy who knows the most is your local mechanic.
Exactly.
He knows.
And a lot of this stuff will be revealed in a pre-purchase inspection if it's done properly.
Exactly. Fourth question. Would you address any special concerns when purchasing a partially complete experimental kit? We get a number of calls from members buying experimentals. A kit or even a certified aircraft that's out of annual or incomplete. And VREF also addresses that, and I provide the same information that VREF would, and that is, what does it take to make it airworthy? Again, I don't know that number. You, the buyer, don't necessarily know that number, I realize. Seller probably doesn't know either. But again, local mechanics probably got a pretty good idea.
Or other, in the case of an RV, for instance, I can speak to an RV because I just bought an RV4 recently. In the case of an RV, for instance, or any other experimental, if you find other owners of that type aircraft, they can give you lots of good guidance on what it's going to take to get the airplane to airworthiness condition, and what kind of money is involved, what kind of time is involved, and what steps. I mean, they can identify for you. We're talking about A to B. Here I am at A. How do I get it to B? B being in flying condition. If you get somebody in there who's experienced with that particular type of experimental aircraft, they can tell you, well, here we are at A, and this is what it's going to take for you to get it to B.
Next question: How much does a pre-buy inspection usually cost? Usually, it's 3 to 4 hours at the standard shop rate. Let's say $100 an hour, so $300 or $400. You can go up from that if you want. If you want further details, all the way up to an annual, and Ray's going to talk about that in a moment from a contractual point.
Yeah, and let's remember that a pre-purchase, and we'll remind everybody of this a little later, really there is no definition of what's included in a pre-purchase inspection, whereas with an annual, you do have regulatory authority that guides what's going to happen with that.
Okay. One or two more questions. Please speak on the common maintenance expense and new transponder directive costs to new buyers, avionics equipment out of date. Common maintenance expense, again, talk with a local mechanic, see what the seller paid for his last 2 annuals. That'll give you an idea where all the component times are. Keeping in mind carburetor, mufflers, magnetos, all might have a prop governors, props, all might have a different life cycle than the engine itself. Transponder directives, I think they're talking about ADSB. We're seeing ADSB. We've just installed some here. ADSB units starting at about $2,000 up to $4,000 to $5,000. Installation costs on the order of 10 to 15 hours, probably. Does that sound like about what you see?
Yeah, that's about right. We just installed ADSB in a number of the AOPA fleet that we use for training and for business travel, and we paid somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 in round numbers for the hardware, and somewhere right around $2,200, maybe $2,500 for installation costs, and that was removing the old equipment and installing new equipment, including the antennas and all the wiring.
There's still some time before the 2020 deadline. That might be changing some. We know shops are filling up, but we can address your individual questions if you want to give us a call on that. Here's a gentleman that's a new private pilot, brand new private pilot. Is a Saratoga too much for him, too much airplane for him? He's cautious and wants to get the right training. Mike, you can help me think about this. I don't think the Saratoga is necessarily too much airplane at all. It's heavier, but it's not particularly, doesn't particularly require excessive or fast attention, I would say. So I don't think it has to be too much airplane, no.
Well, the key with any of these airplanes, no matter what airplane you buy, is to get the proper training.
Insurance would probably require a minimum of 10 hours time and type with a CFI.
Yeah, it depends on the underwriter. It could be 10 hours, could be 15 hours, could be more, depending on your experience.
And the one tip I can give you there, even if you're looking, and I'll assume that Saratoga is a fixed gear, but it's also a constant speed. So it might take a minimum of 5 to 8 hours to get used to that constant speed prop. But since the insurance has you at a 10-hour limitation anyway, all your time is going to be used in training. So that time will go pretty fast, and I don't think it'll be overly a concern for you. Last question here right now regarding pilot skills. Is a 182 beyond someone who's trained in a 172 or an SR20 or SR22? How do you define upgrade? Well, 182 is just getting used to ever so slightly heavier airplane and the constant speed prop. My experience is 5 to 8 hours on a constant speed prop experience, but again, that usually falls within the insurance minimum time of the CFI anyway. What would you add to that, Mike?
Oh, I would say we have lots of pilots here that have transitioned from our 172s to the 182s without any difficulty.
Very quickly. Yeah.
And again, it's just all about training.
Okay. All right, let's we'll hold some questions for later, and we'll continue on our slides.
Okay, so now that you've done your due diligence, the next question is, what do I do before I buy? And some of this we've already talked about, but of course talk with other experienced owners. So they're an excellent source of what you can expect when you acquire a particular aircraft. Also, it's very important, we've talked about this before, to have a mechanic do a pre-purchase inspection and a pre-purchase flight. You just don't know what you're getting into until you have the thing thoroughly examined and get a report from the mechanic. Under an ideal situation, that mechanic, the one you select, would have experience with that particular type of aircraft, so that would give him additional insight into what to look for and what to report to you.
I'm going to just touch briefly on the pre-purchase inspection then next. Okay. Again, Ray's going to talk about the transition from a pre-purchase into an annual potentially. And again, I talked about they can vary in scope and cost. But again, 3 or 4 hours at a minimum, and half of that time may be on the book and paperwork as opposed to just on the airplane, because the details in the AD summary listing, any other bulletins or summaries, and the basic paperwork may take half that time. The maintenance record also may include any Form 337 paperwork, which is major repairs or alterations, or additions and STCs. And again, that's also presented to you in a summary, actually in full details, but you can see everything completely from the title search documentation that does include the FAA file as well. We mentioned here getting a written report of the aircraft and logbook review. That's taken a little more time. Most mechanics are happy to give you verbally a report in great detail. You may not get as large a report if you ask for it all in writing, but you have to think about what you want on that. And again, we also want you to keep in mind, think about how you want to handle any problems that might come up, in that keep in mind and remember, you are hiring the mechanic to go and find anything wrong essentially with this aircraft for you. So probably he's a good mechanic. You found him by his good reputation, and I'll talk about that in a second, but he's likely to find some things. So don't let the mere fact that he finds some mechanical discrepancies dissuade you from your purchase, or the seller from his sale. It's just something the two of you will have to look at, talk about, and decide. So that's not unusual. That happens every time, essentially, so don't let that part worry you. And I mentioned I would talk about how to find a mechanic. Basically, when members, buyers call our Pilot Information Center, we're suggesting the simplest way may be to open our website under the airport directory, find the airport that the airplane is actually on, or an airport nearby, and you'll, about halfway down the page, you'll see a list of businesses on that airfield. One or more of those is likely to be a mechanical shop. There's a little icon of Mechanic's Wrench after the name or website of the shop or the business, and you can tell what they are, what they do. Click on the link. We've got their phone number and their website right there for you. Give them a call and talk about what they do, what they charge, what their experience is. So that's the easiest way and the most common way. There's also, you'd have the ability to potentially check with type clubs, ask for word-of-mouth reference, either in that area or from your local area. And there is one other website, folks we've been working with. It's called flymechanic.com. It's kind of an Angie's List for mechanics. We've met the folks who are developing that, talked to them, liked them. It's a newer site. It's in development, so it's not 100% complete, but I think it is pretty good, so you can take a look at that as well.
The slide has a bullet point that says, make it clear what you want done when it talks about the pre-purchase inspection. And if you've done your due diligence and you've looked at the type club websites and talked to other aircraft owners, they can give you a fairly clear picture of what you should expect that you'll want to be asking the mechanic to look for.
I was going to say, Mike, in one not too long ago case that I dealt with, we actually looked up the checklist that was recommended by the manufacturer for inspections, and we had the mechanic sign off. I was representing the buyer, and a lot of times those discussions really are not detailed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a discussion that's done over the phone, but a lot of times you want to know exactly what is going to be included in that pre-buy because, as I said earlier, there is no strict definition of what will be done in a pre-buy. And so if you've got some specific notions, you want that mechanic to clearly understand what they are. It's only fair to the mechanic and it's fair to you.
Absolutely. It also says on the slide, decide how to handle discoveries. Discoveries mean discrepancies that turn up in the pre-buy inspection. And there's a number of ways you can handle that. One is you can ask that they be taken care of prior to purchase. Another way is that you can negotiate a lower price to cover the cost of those repairs.
That's precisely right. Yeah. And
then finally, when all is said and done, you want to make sure you schedule a final inspection prior to delivery. Most owners I know, when they put an aircraft up for sale, they'll ground the airplane, stick it in the hangar, and they won't even fly it, just because they're afraid they'll ding the airplane or some damage will occur in between the time they post it for sale and the time that it goes out for inspection. So many owners I know will just ground the airplane. So if they don't, of course, then it is subject to some issues, and that's the reason you want to schedule a final inspection prior to delivery. Let's touch on some legal issues now, and this is Ray's bailiwick. He'll take over from here.
Yep, you thought you can get away without a lawyer, but here we are. So there are in fact legal issues that do really have to be addressed in the purchase and sale of an aircraft. And one of the things that's overlooked a lot is just the very simple fact that virtually every state law requires that whenever tangible personal property like an airplane is purchased, there needs to be a written agreement if the purchase price is greater than $500, and that usually encompasses an aircraft purchase. So it's really critical that you get this in writing, and you get that done actually very early. The discussion we've had is not necessarily in chronological order of how things would come out. Oftentimes, you will have that agreement in place before that pre-purchase inspection even begins. In fact, that's the way I would recommend it to any clients I'm dealing with. Get that agreement up front, and then go ahead and lay out the parameters of how you're going to want it inspected and what's going to happen. Just as Mike was suggesting before, if there are any discrepancies, that needs to be known before those discrepancies are found, not afterward, because then the discussion could get to be a little bit messy. You often will want to use somebody who is well-versed in aviation matters. And if you are a member of the legal services plan, it's always shocked me how many members don't avail themselves of the fact that we do offer 1 hour of attorney time, and we write the check for that if you're a basic member of the plan, and 2 hours if you're a plus member of the plan. That will often cover all or a good deal of getting an agreement in place, making arrangements with title and escrow services, a lot of the essentials. So if you are a member, you ought to be taking advantage of that, and it's silly not to. And it's generally local legal help that you can get your hands on with that. So I would urge you to consider it. Now, what I wanted to go over next are some of the issues related to the actual agreement itself.
Before you move on to that, I do want to point out that when you do acquire or secure an aviation attorney, that's a state matter.
That is.
So you want to make sure you get an attorney that's in the state.
And when we do refer members out, we make it a point to get them to attorneys who are either in their state where they reside, where the aircraft will ultimately wind up, or an attorney who might be in the state where the aircraft will be delivered. So we try to talk to the member about that and try to ascertain where the best spot to refer that attorney to.
Exactly.
You want to look at those contract items?
Yeah, these are, there we go. These are just a few of the things that you would typically see in a buy-sell agreement for an airplane. And I'm not going to put you to sleep by going through every one of these, but I do want to hit on some of the highlights that are noted in here. And some of them are a little bit more involved than you might think by just looking at the bullet point. For instance, if you look at identification of the parties, well, that sounds simple enough, but prior to that, you've really got to have an understanding of whether or not you want to take, as the buyer, ownership of that aircraft in your own name as an individual, whether it would be more advantageous to take ownership through a limited liability company or a corporation. And those are discussions that probably do require some legal counsel prior to even getting into the agreement. And I mean, just for the sake of, initial discussion here, it's been my rule of thumb that if you're going to buy the aircraft, you're going to be the only pilot of that aircraft. You'll be the only one flying it for business and pleasure. There probably isn't any great advantage in a limited liability company or a corporation, in other words, separate entity. There's no greater liability protection there. As long as you're PIC, you've got liability. However, if there is any thought to leasing it back to an FBO or getting into this with several other people, then you probably need to consider some form of legal entity like an LLC or a corporation. And frankly, that creates a whole new layer of issues, because then you need an agreement. You need to first set up the entity, right? And then you need to go ahead and draw up agreements between the parties who will all be either members or shareholders in that entity. So identification of the parties is critical, but maybe even more critical is starting off and determining who you want the parties to be. And that's someplace that we do wind up discussing. That's a question we discuss a lot with members. You want to have something in there about, and I'll just take on a couple of these that come up a lot, deposits. Very important to make sure that everybody knows whether they're refundable or not. Sounds really simple. I can't tell you how many times we wind up running into conflict because that hasn't been spelled out. Closing. Well, I have my own strict rule on this. I want my clients to deal with a title and escrow service, and I like to have that title and escrow service handle the logistics of the closing. That means that you've got a third party who's down there in Oklahoma City who will, in fact, take possession and review the bill of sale. They'll get the registration application. They'll get the money. They'll also be able to check for liens. They'll be able to get all the documents releasing the liens. It's an invaluable service. And usually in the contract that you'll see where an escrow service is required, usually the parties will split the cost of that escrow service. It's not all the time that you see that, but typically that's the case. Some other things that need to be thought about are, well, what are we going to do for this pre-purchase inspection? Is it going to be the kind of pre-purchase inspection that Rodney and Mike were talking about a little bit earlier that's not an annual, or do you want a full-blown annual? My experience is in these particular cases is that when an annual is requested, the seller says, okay, we can do an annual, but you're going to have to pay for it. It's going to be at your risk. If you don't like what you find out from the annual, well, that's going to be on you. And every once in a while, we get lucky, and the annual was within maybe 30 days of the purchase, and the buyer looks at that and says, well, I'm going to be satisfied with that and the findings that came from it. So that will vary from time to time. 99% of the time, these deals are as is with all faults. That means that once you get that airplane, it's yours just as you got it. So that's why these pre-purchase inspections and your need to be satisfied about the condition of the aircraft are literally so important, because you can't undo these transactions easily, and you want to make sure that the airplane is in the condition that you expect it to be in. So these are just some of the basic provisions that you would see in a well-written document for buy-sell.
Well, there are a couple of pitfalls you want to avoid, and as Ray said, if you employ a title and escrow service, you can pretty much guarantee that the pitfalls that are on this particular slide you will not encounter. Names on the bill of sale and the registration have to be exactly right, and everything has to match. That's a big bugaboo with the FAA. The Form 8051, which is a registration form, must be an original. No copies. And there are actually two possible ways you can go with the 8050-1. You can get the old carbon copy form, which has been in use for decades, or you can just go to the FAA.gov website and download a PDF, in which case you'll have to make multiple copies so that you have a copy to carry in the aircraft after you buy it, and you have an original copy also to send to the FAA so they can properly register the aircraft. The old carbon copy form, that's all built in together. You keep the pink copy, and the original white copy goes to the FAA. If you list as your address on the registration a P.O. box, you must, in the box immediately below that, list a physical location for the aircraft. The post office box alone is not acceptable to the FAA. And again, looking at possible liens on the title, that would all be covered and taken care of for you by a title and escrow service. The same applies to the risk of fraud without the risk of fraud. I mean, that's something that would be thoroughly investigated and revealed to you if you did employ a title and escrow service.
And I'm going to take a moment and talk about the title and escrow service here for a moment. I think you can see how it's needed, why it's needed, and we'll try to talk a little bit more about it. The AOPA package price, or their package price for an AOPA member, is $95. Usually 2 business day service. Sometimes, if you need it sooner, if you get your request into Aerospace Reports before 9:30 in the morning Central Time, they can get it back to you before or at 5:30. I'm sorry, at 4:30 or 5 the same day. So that's a pretty good service on that. And again, that includes their careful reading of the complete document package to give you a title opinion. Number 2, it includes a physical copy, electronic that is, of all of the aircraft records that the FAA holds on that aircraft by a number in the file at Oklahoma City. And that is every finance or purchase document and every airworthiness document, typically 337 repair alteration type forms. It also includes NTSB and FAA accident incident checks in the database and a report on that. The other services they do have available, title clearing if you need it. That's typically an older bank lien that didn't get released somewhere along the way. And Ray can tell you, we see a lot of those.
Rodney, there's one I just ran across the other day. It was a 40-year-old bank lien that was still sitting out there. And I got to say, they were able to go back, trace the purchases of that bank over time, and get the lien cleared. But it is not unusual you see that. It does happen.
Now, they charge separate fee. They'll give you a quote for that service. But if you need it, that's a valuable service. They can also find and provide title insurance. They can also do closing separate from the escrow if you like. And again, escrows as a package do include a closing and the title search. Typical price on an escrow starts at about $500, possibly $550 now. We'll double check. They'll give you an exact quote, and that's anything up to $50,000. Between $50,000 and $100,000, the price may work towards $575 or $600. That's an estimate. Call them directly for a quote. Aerospace Reports is an AOPA strategic partner, and they are our vendor partner for title work.
Well, Rodney, let me just say I did notice one question that came in related to a lot of these legal issues, and that was what's the best way for me to find an aviation attorney in my area? I know that if the person is a plan member, we've got a list of AOPA panel attorneys for the plan, and we can try to track somebody down who's in your state and hopefully local to you And I think AOPA as well has a pretty comprehensive list of attorneys as well.
We have that same list. I think there are about 700
That's right.
attorneys on that list nationwide. So
Roughly, yeah.
it's a reasonable size list to cover the scope of where you're located.
Very good.
All right, let's pause a second, guys. I'm going to run through some more questions for us here that I think might be appropriate. I think we're on our timeline pretty well, but I'll run right through these. Page 2 of questions here. Does AOPA have a list of fellow pilots in search of co-ownership? Member says he's in Southern California near Chino. I'm trying to think about that. No, not at this time. We previously had a partnership program that did have a website for that purpose. We're not associated with that group at this time or longer, although it was a good group. So no, AOPA does not at the moment, although AOPA number 1 does have 3 classifieds on our website. You could drop a note there. And also the typical note on the airport cafe or the FBO's bulletin board is still a pretty good idea. You probably do see ads for co-ownership also in trade planning barnstormers from time to time. I see those. Second question, does AOPA finance well-known home builds, for instance, an RV9? Yes, it is my understanding that they do on a case-by-case basis. Go ahead and check in with the aircraft finance group. In that same way, will AOPA work as a bank or a broker? AOPA finance group and the insurance group work as brokers. They're finding the ultimate bank or the ultimate underwriter to place that or to make that deal for you. Next question. I've heard it several times that it's best to buy used aircraft with the level of avionics in it that you're looking for, opposed to buying a VFR aircraft and upgrading it to IFR. Does that still hold true if an IFR aircraft is not ADSB out compliant, or is it cheaper or better just to buy VFR or what you want, upgrade it to IFR, and then have consider also the upgrade to ADSB out? I would say, since there are not as many aircraft ADSB out equipped now, you're probably going to end up buying either VFR or IFR and doing your own upgrade. I think the figure, for what it's worth, I think Melissa told us the other day, of the current GA fleet of 180,000 aircraft, for instance, I do believe there are like 18,000 now ADSB out compliant. So what do we got there, 10%? Right. So you're probably going to upgrade. When in the buying process should you pull in the finance team? My understanding is finance team will do credit pre-approvals for you. So if I were shopping, just the way you'd have to shop for a house locally or these days is you'd like to get your financing set up ahead of time. So call them early. They're always happy to talk, and they can do pre-approvals. So I think that's a good way to go.
Absolutely. I've got a friend of mine right now shopping for an airplane, and he's already called the AOPA finance division and has already gone through the pre-approval process.
Yeah, because if you find that hot model that's finally just right for you, although financing, I think another question is here, how long does financing take? And I think it's 2 to 3 days on the basic order. You'd still not like to lose that hot buy just for that 2 or 3 days work. So get it set up ahead of time.
Well, you need to know going up front whether you can afford the airplane or not.
Exactly.
If you get turned down for your financing, then you're dead in the water.
When applying for an aircraft loan, do you have to have a specific plane or just a make and model? Again, they'll do credit pre-approvals. And again, for further details, talk with the aircraft finance group about that. End of page 2 question here. At a $250 airplane loan you mentioned, what about the other costs? What's the actual figure? Well, that again, we'd send you back to our operating cost estimator. You'll know the hangar or tie down rate. Check locally at your local airport. You'll be easily able to figure out everything except the maintenance. But again, the way to do that, although there's a general figure on our cost estimator, it's talk to the mechanic, the type clubs, and the local other airplane owners of the same make and model to get a feel for that. And you'll get a feel for that and then just break it down. I can when you talk about hourly rate, obviously the $250 is a monthly rate. If you want to start breaking down hourly, you can figure most new buyers think they'll fly 150, 200 hours a year. What we see they end up flying first year is 100 or 150. However, I should point out to you, unfortunately, the average hours flown per year has dropped over the last years, and the average for a four-place single these days is about 70, 75 hours a year. That's all, unfortunately. But again, new buyer does better, and obviously we'd like to see that number higher for everybody, so that's what we're all about. All right, I've got another quick page of questions here. I'll be fast, guys. Is it common for lenders to put limitations on aircraft age? Yeah, I think a lot of banks do, but we work with at least 8 or 10 banks, I do believe, and we can find somebody who'll work with you, is my understanding. How concerned should I be about hail dents? That comes up. Talk to folks about that. What insurance companies will do will work with mechanics and determine how bad those hail dents really are. What you'd like to do if you're buying an aircraft with hail dents, see if the seller has ever been paid by his insurance company already for those hail dents. That's what you got to find out, because usually hail dents are not repaired without reskinning. What insurance companies will do if an owner has modest hail dents, they will make that decision by standing around a circle with nothing else, and they will offer to pay 10, 15, or 20% of the value of the aircraft for those hail dents as a diminished value, as long as the mechanic feels that hail dents still leave the aircraft airworthy. So you want to find out, has the owner ever collected any money from the insurance company already? If he has, you can get a better deal. Would you include recurrent training if you've got a high-performance aircraft? Yeah, I definitely think you want to look at that, and that's something to do. Sure. No prepayment penalties. Are there prepayment penalties on a loan? No. Aren't property taxes a significant cost? Generally, property taxes separate from sales and use are not that significant, although in a few states, they could be, or bigger cities, or with brand new aircraft, they could be a larger bite. Call us and we can help you look at those.
Well, and the thing with that is it is very much a strictly state and local issue.
Exactly.
And so a lot of times you're going to need to get with local counsel to make sure that you're getting the best answer on that. Those are very state and local specific issues.
Yeah, we've seen rates vary from state to state, municipality to municipality, from anywhere from 2 to 9%. So it definitely is something you want to do. Check
All right, we're going to jump back on our slides so we can keep our time going. We'll get to some more questions at the end.
All right, Rodney, thank you. I just wanted to talk a little bit about insurance. First thing you need to know is that when you look at your policy and when you look to get a policy, there's really two parts to it. One of them is the liability part, and the other part is the hull part. The hull part is the part that's a little easier to understand. That's the part, well, if I ding my airplane, how much am I going to be covered for that? And typically you'd want that to be at least at the replacement value of the aircraft. For the liability side of it, what we will typically see is a $1 million liability policy, but you need to understand that in many cases there will be what we call sublimits on that liability amount. And often they'll be referred to, and it'll depend on the policy, in terms of a per passenger or per seat or per person limit. Quite often that's around $100,000 per seat, per person, per passenger. So you need to make sure that you understand if you've got sublimits on it. If you want to try to eliminate the sublimits and get what we call a smooth policy, and that again just means a policy without sublimits, you'll need to talk to your insurer. You'll need to see if you meet the underwriting limits to get that kind of policy. Obviously that would be a bit more expensive, but for many that's an important item. You'll want to make sure that the people who are going to be flying the plane are actually covered. Your policy is in effect for the folks who you intend to fly it. So you've got to let your insurance company know the names and the qualifications, obviously, of those who will be flying. Sometimes the authorization is more of a blanket authorization in the form of an open pilot clause, meaning that whoever might have, X amount of hours is going to be qualified under that policy. And finally, without getting into too much detail, you do need to be aware of what your use of that aircraft will be. Typically for our members, it's going to be a business and pleasure policy rather than a commercial policy. But even there, and we were talking about this earlier, got a lot of members who use their aircraft at least in part for their business. I often try to talk to them ahead of time to find out if they have any intention of flying, for instance, employees around. And I ask that question of them because many of the policies that are out there will exclude employees who might be covered under workman's comp, and that could be problematic. So you want to make sure that your insurer knows what you intend to use that plane for, and they can certainly help steer you in the right direction to make sure that that policy meets your needs. So that's some of the basics on insurance.
AOPA Insurance Services has been in the market for 20 years. We've insured more GA aircraft, including light sport, turbine, and experimental airplanes than anybody else in the world. And because of our clout, we have access to major carriers with A ratings that can provide you with coverage options to fit whatever your needs may be. And you can contact the AOPA Insurance Group. Follow the link on the website, www.aopainsurance.org, or call them at the 800 number during normal business hours, and they'll be happy to accommodate your needs.
All right, I want to talk about the basic bill of sale form real quick for a moment. From our visual copy here, we're going to fill in the blue areas. Again, if you've hired the escrow service, they will review your documentation once you submit it. But basically, you're going to put in some dollar amount of compensation. Although FAA doesn't care about that, the state agency who sees this later may, but you need some dollar amount there to complete the portion that constitutes a legal contract per se. Although Ray's going to tell you more about the contract nature of this document momentarily. So we've got N number, make, model, and serial, obviously, the date, purchaser information, and again, simply things like make sure it's last name, comma, followed by first name and then middle initial, address underneath, dealer certificate number. That's is the purchaser a dealer? Typically not, so you'll simply put an N/A, not applicable. Again, some language talking about the seller saying that this is for the benefit of the executors, administrators, and assigns of the purchaser, basic contract language. Again, a date, date that the seller signs, his name, typed or printed, signature, and title. And again, title for an individual seller, owner would be either individual or owner. Title for a co-owner would be co-owner. Title for an LLC member in most states will be simply member. Could be a managing member, but most likely it's a basic member.
Right. And that dollar amount that Rodney was talking about, and even if you're just transferring the aircraft to a brother or a family member or a partner, you still have to have a dollar amount there. It can be $1.
Well, a lot of times people just put in $1 plus other valuable consideration, OVC. But do keep in mind that when states are looking at this sort of thing for purposes of sales and use tax, they're not paying any particular attention to what's written in there. They're actually looking to see what was truly paid, and if they can't get their hands on that, what they'll look for is something perhaps in VREF, where they can actually get a good valuation on that particular aircraft. So beware, don't be led into thinking that what you put in there is going to be used by state authorities for sales and use tax information.
Correct. Real quickly, we'll take a look at the registration form again. This is available now online. Mike has talked to you about the fact that previously this had been a carbon paper document, a single white sheet, and a pink slip. Those are still viable. We still have a supply, still send those out. FAA still has some, but as of May 1st, they accepted the federal digital signature law, which means this is available online as a paper document. However, it still needs an original signature. That's the main thing to remember. And again, you're just putting in your basic N number, aircraft information, serial number, again, name of applicants and phone number, mailing address. Again, as Mike mentioned earlier, if you use a P.O. box, you do still need an additional physical address location. There's a checkbox if you're using this document as only a change of address, not a factor on a purchase. The certification area simply means when you sign the document below, you're certifying that you are a U.S. citizen or green card holder. You're not an alien. So you're going to leave the certification area blank. That's what your signature has said when you read the first item. And again, you will sign and print or type under your name, again with title and date.
Right, and with this, I think we were talking about a little bit earlier, the fact that if you've got an LLC here, that you may need to also, you will need to submit an LLC statement, which essentially lays out that the members qualify as U.S. citizens, and that's actually another form that title and escrow companies have readily available for you when you go ahead to close. So another reason to think about that.
If you're looking for these forms, we're pulling them off of our title vendor's website, www.aerospacereports.com. Look for the tab on Forms, F-O-R-M-S, and there's your bulleted list of available forms. The nice thing about that website is you can type right into the online form, print out what you've just typed, which saves you a lot of time and effort and easy correction.
And right, Rodney, they've got the form that I just referred to for that LLC statement right on that web page. Yep.
Correct.
All right, sales and use tax. We could take the whole night to talk about this. I'm just going to sensitize you to the issue. We've hinted at it before. In some states, this is not an issue because they don't have a sales or use tax, but most states do have sales and use taxes. And to not consider this prior to the purchase of an aircraft is really folly, because it could be as much as an 8 to 9% hit and an unpleasant surprise to those who haven't thought about it. So it's not to say that you can avoid it every time, but you need to be aware of it so that you understand what the true cost of this purchase will be, right? Now, let me just make one distinction that's probably the most important thing I have to say about this. The sales tax piece of this is determined in the state where you make the purchase or take delivery of the aircraft. So in aircraft purchases, often you may be taking delivery in one state, right, and then bringing it to your home state for your own use, right? Now, you need to be certain that in the state where you're taking delivery, there is some form of exemption that we often call a flyaway exemption. And that means that if you take delivery of an aircraft in that state and you essentially fly it away within a certain period of time, states vary widely on this, 10 days, 15 days, then you get an exemption in that state. Now, once you bring it to your home state, then you are subject to the use tax. And you need to understand whether or not you have any kind of exemption that might be applicable to that. You may not, but it's probably worth determining whether you do. Like I said, it could be anywhere up to an 8 or 9% additional cost of the purchase. So spending a few hours of local lawyer or CPA time to look at this, and it often doesn't even take that much, is probably a very worthwhile precaution. Believe me, states will find out that you've bought that aircraft into their state. They regularly get lists of transactions from FAA. They get a list of any newly registered aircraft in the state, and they'll contact you with a little letter congratulating you on your purchase and requesting their sales or use tax. We do mention personal property taxes in this slide. They are different from sales and use taxes, and that's something, again, that needs to be looked at the very local level. It can vary from county to county and city to city. That's how localized that particular issue gets. You don't see this in every state, but you do have to be aware of it and take a look at it before you purchase an aircraft. Now we're on the federal income tax. And this really, there's no initial federal income tax ramification when you purchase the aircraft necessarily, but you want to understand how your federal income taxes might be influenced by your purchase. Usually, we're going to be talking about business use here. So you want to have this thought through before you make your purchase. If you do, in fact, have a profit motive in a business and you're going to be using an aircraft in that business, the expenses of transportation by personal aircraft have been deemed by the tax court and the IRS through many tax cases that have been fought in the past to be ordinary, necessary, reasonable expenses and therefore allowable as deductions. So you want to think that through with your tax counsel, and a lot of times what you're looking at, it doesn't have to be all business use, but the percent of hours that you do fly for business will, generally speaking, allow you a deduction for if you use your aircraft for business purposes. So take a look at this and calculate it into those ongoing costs, because you might be able to reduce some of those as you think about purchasing an aircraft.
Ray, shall we mention for state sales and use tax how the potential buyer may start to check that process?
You mean in terms of how do you get the answers to your questions? Well, I mean, you've got to, my best answer to that, Rodney, is you almost have to be in touch with local counsel on that. And we do typically through the plan get people referred out locally to answer that question because it is such a state and local specific issue.
Very good.
So when you get to the end of this whole process, then you get to the point where you're ready to sign on the dotted line. You want to make sure that you visually inspect the aircraft. You want to make sure that no damage has occurred since your pre-purchase inspection. You want to make sure that all the conditions of the contract have been fulfilled, just as Ray said. If you have a very thorough and well thought out contract, you want to go through that contract point by point and make sure that all the conditions are fulfilled. And then, of course, comes the transfer of the necessary documents for ownership. This is kind of a summary here. The paperwork that you're going to send to the FAA is going to include the 8050-1 registration application. That's a two-part form, as Rodney said. One part goes to the FAA, the other part goes into the aircraft, and that becomes your temporary registration that's good for 90 days.
Yeah, on the new digital signature, even though you're printing a form off the website, that's fine. It's not a copy. It's considered an original form. You do need to sign that in two original signatures. One's going to go to the FAA. The second, again, with the original signature, would go in the aircraft.
And then the 8050-2 bill of sale, again, that's an original document that goes to the FAA, and you'll want a copy for your own records.
And again, the original forms always were in duplicate paper, but now, again, you can print the copy of the form itself. Original form, it is a copy, printed from the website. You do need original signatures, as Mike just said. But again, we're suggesting at least two, probably three original signatures, because both buyer and seller should have a copy, and again, one is going to the FAA.
And then there's the 8050-3, that's the existing registration that's in the aircraft before you purchased it. That's really up to the previous owner to send into the FAA, but you can include it in your package if you wish when you send your documents into the FAA.
And again, that's like taking the license plate off your car when the seller sells it, when the airplane's leaving the control of the seller to the buyer. That's going to be returned to the FAA to take liability off of the seller, to let FAA know what's happening, to let FAA expect in the future to see a new purchase, the purchase documentation we've talked about here, come in from the buyer. And again, only the registration card gets sent in, not the airworthiness. Airworthiness document is going to stay in the pouch in the aircraft.
And if you look at that registration card, it's a white kind of a cardboard card. If you flip that over to the back side, you'll see there's a space on there where the previous owner signs, which in essence transfers ownership of the aircraft to the new owner.
Right, now let me just add to this that there's a lot of details involved in this, and one of the best ways to have this dealt with, again, I can't emphasize it enough, is to consider having this handled by a title and escrow service. They will dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and make sure all of this paperwork is properly filed and timely filed as well.
And that's a good point, Ray, because we do know FAA previously was taking approximately 3 weeks to process your registration application. Now, however, unfortunately, with all the UAS and drone registrations, they are currently at 6 weeks. So you don't want to submit something wrong and wait 5 or 6 weeks to hear about it.
Oh, right, and that's exactly how long. It could take longer than that sometimes, and you'd be surprised, and I'm always shocked at how many times I get calls where there have been second and third submissions with errors, and it just takes a huge amount of time to get through all of that, and it could have been solved by just simply dealing with the pros down there in Oklahoma City.
Exactly.
And of course, don't forget the $5 recording fee, the check made out to the FAA. And as Ray said earlier, if you are purchasing the aircraft under the auspices of an LLC or a corporation, you want to make sure that you have that LLC cover letter form, which is it's called a Statement in Support of Registration of a United States Civil Aircraft in the name of a limited liability company.
And again, if you have some questions still, go ahead and get those in. We're going to be maybe another 5 or 10 minutes at most. If you can hang with us, we'll try to wrap up the rest of our questions that we have time for. And keep in mind, Cher from the insurance agency is also online. So if you have a basic insurance question, you could put that in as well. If we can't get to it today, put your phone number with it, and either ourselves or Cher can get back to you tomorrow with an answer.
Sure.
So the first question here from members, what about leaseback agreements? We didn't mention that with the local FBO. That's kind of a topic in itself, but AOPA does have an entire section for leasing or leases on our website. Just Google AOPA and Guide to Leasing. Be happy to answer any questions at the Pilot.
And let me just add to that any kind of a leaseback will require some pretty careful review because it has income tax implications and perhaps even sales and use tax implications. There are some states where if you purchase an aircraft with the intention of leasing it, you may even be entitled to an exemption. But again, it's very state specific, so you have to look at that sort of thing. And certainly there are federal tax implications because in essence then you're in the leasing business and revenue and expenses need to be recorded and that's why when you're looking at a lease back you do need typically some professional help.
And we could do about another hour and a half.
Absolutely. It's that's a topic unto itself. Next
question, does VREF have info for experimental aircraft? Yes, some, not all that many, but the most popular. Certainly the RVs and a few others. Is there a restriction on financing from older aircraft, 1960s or 1970s? Some banks have restrictions on 1950s and early 1960s aircraft. Yes, I think it's only a few, but again, feel free to call our aircraft finance group directly. They'll look at the situation and let you know what they have or what they can find, so easy enough to solve. Are you better off finding a plane with upgraded avionics or doing the upgrades yourself? That's always a toss-up. Generally speaking, you can You can save money by having your avionics already done, but these days there are other choices in airframes and engines that could be almost as important and just as significant dollar-wise, so I don't think we can say yes or no to that. Do you believe ADS-B is going to cause long-time owners to sell their planes instead of meeting the requirement? In the next 2 or 3 years, is it going to be a buyer's market? That's interesting. We've read that. We hear that some. We see that.
But nobody really knows.
But yeah. But we have to think, though, ADS-B prices have come down. Initially, they were near $10,000. Then they were $7,000. Then they were $6,000. You can get superb units now for $5,000.
Or even $2,000.
Other units now $19.95 plus install. So,
but here's the rub: if you wait, the closer you get to the deadline, the more jammed the shops are going to be. So you may get yourself into a position where your aircraft is grounded as of January 1st, 2020, and you can't fly it because it's not compliant, and there's a 6-month backlog at the local shop.
That's right.
Exactly. Stay tuned and give us a call. We'll give you an update. How does escrow play a role in aircraft purchasing? Usually escrow costs, although it generally protects the buyer, it does protect both buyer and seller, so a lot of people just split that. So a couple $100 from each party, I don't think the escrow cost really hurts a purchase, and it benefits it clearly.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Rodney. It's something that I think is essential to every transaction.
Next question here. Broker gave a member aircraft valuation based on Blue Book. That was higher than the VREF he saw probably online. What's correct? How do you handle that? How do you handle items that VREF doesn't handle, like a 2-year-old interior? Again, Blue Book is an older service comparable to VREF. The current VREF editor used to work for Blue Book, so they know each other very well. What I have seen is their numbers are almost identical. When you see a difference, it's by the fact of the input that was put into the program. There's not that much difference in the true market value. It's how they label retail versus mid-range versus wholesale. So I think it's more labeling. I've not honestly seen much difference between the two. I think they're both right on, and they are both based on virtually the same previous quarter live sales. So that would tend to tell me there's not a lot of difference. Another question, does title search cover Canadian aircraft? No, you've got to get your title search done in Canada. If you call COPA, call us, we'll give you COPA's number. COPA is Canadian Owners and Pilots in Ottawa. They have the same structure. They're an AOPA affiliate in Canada, and they'll actually find you an attorney in the Canadian province to do that title search for you. All right, I think I got another minute. I've got some other questions here. How long does it take to complete a purchase with financing? And again, I think we talked about that 2 or 3 days. How do you find a good pre-buy inspector, and what should his cost be? Again, you'd use the airport search method or flymechanic.com. You're usually looking at 3 or 4 hours, typically average minimum. I don't have a trusted mechanic. How do I find one? And that's usually word of mouth at your local airport. That's still the best deal. Another question, how does one inspect for corrosion in the wing spar when the wing is closed and hidden by the fuel tank? You can usually see all the spar except the spar behind the fuel tank. Very good question. That's a typical Cherokee problem. It also does come up in Cessna aircraft as well. I've seen that in a 140. Hey, you've got to pull the tank out if there's any question. That's all there is to it. So that's 2 or 3 more hours, but that's the only way to know if there's any question. But you can kind of judge from the rest of the airplane. Are there any hidden problem costs with purchasing an aircraft like a North American Navion, which, although reasonable in purchase price, it's limited in production years, and that worries me, worries the member. Yeah, any specialty item, any specialty airplane like that, limited production, older airplane, antique, classic, there's more to be aware of, but that's where the type clubs are so good. Navions have an excellent tape club. Give those guys a call, and I think that might eliminate a lot of your concern. If the airplane you're buying has an airworthiness certificate and has been properly maintained, do you need to apply for a new certification? No, airworthiness certificate remains in effect unless it has ever been canceled. And the only reason the airworthiness would have ever been canceled is if the aircraft were going out of the country, or had a major accident where the insurance provider notified the FAA that it had major damage or they wished to cancel it. So generally you would not have to get a new airworthiness certificate. The only other situation is if you change the N number. You would get a certificate then. If a plane is offered with a fresh annual, is a pre-buy still necessary? That's a good one. Yes, I think it still is, because you'd like to know who did the fresh annual. Again, we always say that it's desirable to have a fresh party, a third set of eyes, look at the airplane, somebody who hasn't seen it before. It's true that the last guy who did the annual inspection probably does know it best, but you don't know his relationship with the seller. Not that there's very often a problem, but there could be, so you like to have fresh eyes.
Well, and sometimes, Rodney, there's also a problem. The annual is looking at airworthiness items. The pre-buy might uncover things that may not necessarily be airworthiness items that you don't like, right? Things that might not have been detected or dealt with in the annual that still would be important to you.
And it's really what Rodney said about fresh eyes is very critically important. We've had situations with our own fleet aircraft where the aircraft were done, the annual was done by other parties, and then we had a third party look at it, and they discovered things that really should have been picked up in a previous annual, but just were overlooked.
Is it crazy to buy a plane before completing your VFR private pilot certificate? This member is planning to go through IFR training, would like to complete stage 2 VFR and IFR in a plane that he owns. No, I don't think that's crazy. Choose a reasonable airplane. You can grow into it. We've talked about that. Transition is usually not that hard and usually not too significant an insurance issue.
Folks, we're just about out of time here. We sure thank you for joining us here this evening. We hope we've provided you with some insight into purchasing an aircraft. We understand there are many more questions that we didn't get to, and please feel free to call the Pilot Information Center during working hours, and we'll be happy to pursue any questions you have further. There's a wealth of information on the website, so feel free to use that as an investigative tool and as part of your due diligence.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Good evening. Good night now.